Archives are about space and about time. There is always a hidden something that we have to look for very carefully.
A hidden concept, a hidden document, and a hidden narrative. How can we preserve an archive?
And how can we preserve documents in an archive? Archives are very important as a protest against forgetting.
If we want to anticipate the future, the lessons of history as a discipline are central to the art of archiving.
The future is sometimes invented with fragments from the past. So I'm really happy we can do this interview for the Foster Foundation, and the theme is archive.
Yes.
And I wanted to kind of begin with the beginning. I have many questions, of course, about the Library of Exile, about your own archive, about the idea of memory also in connection to the Letters to Commando book. But before all of that, I wanted to begin with the beginning and ask you how it all began, how you came to art and literature, or how art and literature came to you, if there was a kind of an epiphany.
I mean, it's been there from the beginning, actually, to be honest, Hans Ulrich. So I mean, as a child, I started making pots as a 5-year-old, but I grew up in a house. My family are writers, so I grew up surrounded by and libraries, actually, expectation that you would that really the only thing that was worth doing was writing. So actually to then branch out into the world of actually making things was quite a kind of decisive thing in my family, because there are no artists in my family at all. But so for me, it's been this navigation right from the beginning of literature and this independent world of shaping the world through my hands, of actually making things, ex nihilo. And then coming later to books, coming later to actually writing them, but obviously saturated in literature from the start, really.
And of course, ceramics played a very crucial role in that. And that's interesting because there is at the moment a very strong return of a lot of young artists to ceramics. I see doing like studio visits with artists of the millennial generation and even younger, that there is this massive return. And you, of course, then as in an early book started to write actually a history of ceramics. And that, of course, brings us already to the theme of archives, because in a way, I suppose you kind of brought together a lot of documents about ceramics, because there is, of course, not one history. There are so many histories of ceramics on all planets, on all continents.
Well, the reason I started writing about them was that I felt that the books weren't there. That and to find my way as an artist, as a potter, I had to find my own history. And because I take the long way around, that meant I had to start writing the damn things, which meant working in Japan in the archives of the folk craft tradition, Leech and Hamada. It meant writing a book on 20th century ceramics 20 years ago, trying to see how artists throughout the 20th century had used clay, because there wasn't a book that looked at how Fontana and Miro and Picasso actually used ceramics, and architects used ceramics. So I just needed to write them. That took me, as you say, into archives, and one of the profound joys for me, it's sort of almost the third leg of my life is sort of making and writing and research. And the research bit is profoundly spent in different people's archives. And of course, the great thing about archives, as you well know, is that people say that there are roadmaps, there are dictionaries, there are card indexes. But in fact, when you're in an archive, you are completely alone. You make up your own route through, and that's very exciting. And it's finding those epiphanies, those connections between things that allow you intellectually to start to make your own narrative, make your own history.
And that led then to the wide road, basically, to the idea of a book, no?
Yes. So it's all autobiography. It's all trying to understand why I'm drawn and driven to make things out of clay. The White Road, it was, why am I using porcelain for 35 years of my life? What is it about this material? And it's a real question. And that takes me into really not only a kind of the known history of porcelain, of, Augustus the Strong and Meissen and Jing de Gen and all those sort of things that we know from history, but into really complicated and difficult places, which are about porcelain and obsession, porcelain and desire, porcelain and power, right into the Third Reich, into really the sort of the moments when porcelain is used in terms of obsessional devotion to whiteness. So all of these things have to be thought through and looked at, and of course, you go back to archives. You go back to, not to secondary sources. My God, I'm here surrounded by thousands of books, which are the secondary sources. But you go back to being in a place, picking up one document and then another, and then another, and then another, and struggling your way through.
Now it's fascinating because books bring us also to the Hair with Amber Eyes and the extraordinary exhibition, which I've just seen actually the day before yesterday at the Jewish Museum in New York City, which actually an exhibition designed by Dilo Scofidio, where actually your book is somehow the subject, the point of departure, and the subject of the exhibition. And I wanted to ask you to tell me a little bit about how this all began, because of course, I mean, it has a lot to do with memory, and it made me actually think of the late Eric Hobsbawm, because when I moved to London in 2006, I visited Eric Hobsbawm, and we talked about history and the digital age. And I always remember he said, we live in an age where we have more and more information, but the fact that we have more and more information doesn't necessarily mean that we have more memory. So in a way, he said we actually need a protest against forgetting. And I was thinking a lot about that in the exhibition. I saw it almost like as a protest against forgetting.
Well, it's a wonderful line of Eric's. I mean, it is absolutely fantastic and wonderful to hear you remember him remembering that. That's a tremendous chain of connection. I mean, as you know, the book came out of an inheritance and of these objects, and really. For me, it was a profound struggle to try and understand what I'd actually inherited when I was given this collection of Netscape from my great uncle. And there was a moment very early on after I'd inherited them when I thought there's two options with this. One is to sort of anecdotalize about them, just have them in a vitrine in the corner of our drawing room and just tell the children, blah, 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 they came from this lovely old man and his partner, they were wonderful. Or there was this sort of, there was the other route, and the other route was really a challenge to actually understand what they meant, which is such an easy one-liner, but to unpack that was about belonging and place, about what had survived and why that had survived and other things hadn't. It took me all the way down back into extraordinary sort of history of the untold story of my Jewish family, untold by my father. So of course it's completely predicated on an archive that hasn't been passed to me, memories that haven't been passed on to me from my father, and what I can discover despite him. So in that sense, any history where you begin to try and understand the meaning of where your family comes from is often despite your family. It's despite what you've been told. So that takes you back to original sources, original places, places of encounter where memory still resides, or memory has been erased or effaced. So you're always dealing with what you can find and what you is simply gone. That, of course, makes you an archivist. It makes you someone who is tabulating constantly through their fingertips the meaning of memory, and what then you choose to do with it, which in this case turned into a book and more recently into an exhibition. That was the very long-winded way of answering your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's beautiful. Thank you so much. Because before that, I wanted to ask you about another aspect of archive, because I'm very, very fascinated by your book, Letters to Commando. Many congratulations. It's one of the great books of our time. And I was so fascinated in this book about many things. But one thing which I thought would be interesting to discuss is the aspect of the Fernand Brodelian longue durée, no? Because we live in an age, as Roman Kajarnik, the philosopher, says, of short-termism. And I think the big question is how, also in terms of the environmental crisis, the extinction crisis, this whole event culture is just not sustainable. So how can we actually come up with more long durational formats? And that means also thinking about the transgenerational contract in a way, thinking about generations who are not born yet and the responsibilities we have for them. But it thinks also about projects on which we maybe work not with a deadline, but on which we work maybe our whole life. I mean, the Sagrada Familia is a beautiful example of Gaudi. It's still not finished. Work is still ongoing. So that's the other thing, the aspect of actually projects on. And so there are many aspects of how Kajarnik shows of how we can actually liberate society from this short-termism. And of course, archives are such a long durational device in a way, and so are museums. And you say in the Letters to Commando that it's about this creation of something enduring, but it's also in a very interesting way about conversation. And obviously, I record all these, interviews and conversations with artists. I've so far recorded about 4,000 hours, of conversation with artists. So it's a kind of an archive of conversation. So I was very, very fascinated and deeply touched by, in Letters to Commando, by your idea, by your description really of this place being a collection for these incredible conversations where people from all over the world would come together. And it makes it particularly urgent at this moment where we have all these new forms of localisms, of nationalisms. It's a very urgent book.
Well, thank you for reading it, for goodness sake. I mean, for me, there's so much there. I mean, one thing, of course, is that, unpacking the extraordinary sort of the painful nature of the Musée de Commando, unpacking the idea of creating a museum where all this potential is possible, a house where all these conversations are possible, conversations back to Voltaire and Diderot and to the philosophe, but forward into the future. And then it obviously, because of the nature of what happens to the family, this memorial becomes stuck at this particular moment. It becomes, there it is on the Rue de Monceau, and nothing has changed since 1936. And in some ways, what happens to it is that it becomes a museum of decorative arts. It becomes this. It becomes an institution, and that heart which you identify, that the meaning of it, the profound meaning of it, which is that any memorial stretches forward and back. It's what André Asserman, a great novelist, calls the irrealis mood. It's a wonderful word. It means that the tense, it's neither the present tense or the past tense. It's a particular moment where you are both completely conscious of conversations that you necessarily have to have with Voltaire. You know, the argument you really need to have with Voltaire, and you're absolutely conscious of being there with some students who are anxious about everything that's happening, you know, on their doorstep, and you're also conscious that you're there with your father, who is still trying to work out his experience of 1939, and all of these different people and tenses and possibilities are there within that one building and that one collection. That's made possible through the archive. It's made possible by this laying down carefully of the possibility of someone else completely redefining and shaking up all these different objects, all these different bits of papers, all these different manuscripts that you have carefully put together, you know, here and here and here. And what you're doing is you're giving forward into the future an idea of radical, generous reappraisal, in some ways of a sort of vigorous rethinking of the groundworks of what you think you have done. So Commando, what I'm trying to do with my letters to this dead man, this dead cousin, is to talk to him profoundly about the nature of his great project, and also trying to understand my great project. My great project, as you know, which is both in my pots and in my books, is to try and understand what is being passed on in memory into my hands, and then what I pass on. So it is absolutely about the durée. It's also about you know, the places of memory, you know, and where you might identify them, locate them, record them, bring people to them, ask them to engage with them.
So one thing I was also curious, and I found relatively little in interviews with you, is about your own library and about your own archive. I mean, we are Zooming here. It's still during the COVID time. Otherwise, of course, we would have met in London, but we are Zooming. And during the Zoom, one of the things we often see in the background is fragments. It's like a passport toto, no? It's this little screen. It's a passport toto of libraries. So we see some of your books in the background, but obviously there must be many, many more.
There are thousands.
Exactly. So I was curious about your own library and also about your many different archives, because I suppose the books are, of course, only one part of your archive, because I suppose there is also for each. I mean, I remember my last visit with Umberto Eco, which was very, very memorable, because I went to Milano, to his very beautiful apartment where he had many books, and he explained to me that an archive always hides another archive. And he had this key. It was almost, at a certain moment, I was almost a bit scared, because it sort of made me think of the name of the rose, no? Because he had a big key in his pocket, and then there was a room where only he had the key. So his staff and not even the family could actually enter there. And then he opened the door, and we entered this sort of this very secret room where he kept the old manuscripts. It felt like a medieval library in some sorts. But then also he had, of course, mini libraries of many different, you know, projects. I mean, he was working at the time, I think, on one of his last books. It was the book about the cemetery of Prague, and he was actually at that moment very much researching anti-Semitism in many different moments in time, and had that library related to that specific book. And he showed to me in the library almost like the different books produced mini archives. And with me, it's a bit the same. I mean, I have a sort of a mini archive of, you know, it's mostly, of course, now digital for each exhibition. So I imagine what we see in the background is not only a passport toto fragment of all your books, but it's also one of your many archives.
You're absolutely right. So it's everything is plural. I mean, let's start with that. So yes, I mean, there are, around the corner, there's thousands of books, and then at home there's many thousands of books. And this is just working books on different projects. And behind me, you know, a teapot by Malevich. I'm doing something. It's 100 years since Rilke finished the Duino Elegies. So I have all my grandmother's books that Rilke gave her here, because I've got to do a lecture about the sonnets to Orpheus next week. And then there's bits of Vienna, and there's bits of all kinds of. So of course, but actually, you know, we have a room here which is called the Archive, which has pots going back in my life to my very first pots in the 1970s. We have boxes of broken shards from around the world, picked up in Jingdezhen or in Meissen, or in we have broken Meissen bowls with kintsugi. So we have physical archives. We have huge. Every project is put to bed, quotes, in huge boxes. And there's a possibility that all this archive will go on to an institution, which I'm talking about at the moment with them, which is a great joy. But of course, the reality is that you can't let anything go. This is what Umberto echoes, the encounter, your extraordinary vivid encounter with Umberto echoes, is that until you've died, the archive is a work in progress, because it's an iterative conversation. You are a perpetual archaeologist of your own previous projects and writings and thinkings and meanderings. You come back to them and they've changed, and then you bring things back into the light and have to examine them again. And so, you know, you can't actually archive your own work. You need someone else to do it. You need a forensic view of those fragments that you have shored up against your ruin, as Eliot brilliantly put it. Otherwise, they're just fragments, you know. So you know, it's always a work in progress, and all you can do is to, without hubris, just put things aside. I mean, or you're interrupted by your life. And I mean, I did spend a couple of years working on a project with the Walter Benjamin archive, which is obviously for all of us is the kind of great and painful example of the archival principle. You know, how you attempt to keep fugitive ideas and notes alive while the world has fallen apart around you.
Sure. I had two last questions. One is, before we looked at your early editions of Rainer Maria Rilke books, and one of the books I keep returning to is, also in all the conversations, is Rainer Maria Rilke's wonderful little book, which is The Advice to a Young Poet. So I wanted to ask you what in 2022 would be your advice to a young artist, or your advice to a young poet, or to a young novelist, or to a young writer?
You know, I dare to do it. Just keep living in that moment of utter danger, of just trying it out and not closing yourself down. I mean, that's what Rilke says 100 years ago. You know, you must change your life, he says. And that remains the line that I feel is the true, you know, the true piece of advice for any young artist or poet or potter or musician. You know, you must change your life. You must live on that particular edge. It's bloody difficult. Of course it is, all that, all the logistics, all that stuff. But actually, that particular truth, I think, remains brightly burning. Nothing pragmatic. No pragmatic advice, never. No pragmatic advice ever. It's always wrong-headed, and it will always sink you, never.
I love it. Thank you. And very last question. I thought it would be interesting for this interview for our readers who will read it and watch it, to tell them maybe about 1 or 2 or 3 of your favorite archives to visit. I mean, I often think, of course, about the Warburg archive, and I kind of return to Warburg's work as you do all the time, because I grew up in Kreuzlingen. I mean, I went to school to Lyceum in Kreuzlingen, and I passed by always this, when I was like 12, 13, 14, 15, I passed by this old, this sort of haunted house. And I once asked my teacher what it was, and it was the clinic, of Dr. Binswanger. So that's why kind of Warburg became the first, kind of became my entry into art and art history, because of course it's where he wrote, in the clinic of Dr. Binswanger, he wrote the serpent ritual, the book on the serpent ritual, the Hopi serpent ritual. Yeah. And of course you're doing this project for the Warburg now in London. So I suppose the Warburg is an important archive for you. So I wanted to ask you about that, about Warburg, but also maybe about 1 or 2 other examples of archives you would advise us to go.
So the most intellectually and visually stimulating books that I would pass and put on any young writer or artist's hands, apart from going to the Warburg and being in that archive, are 2 books, both of which you know very well. One is the extraordinary edition of Walter Benjamin's archive, which actually is, it's going to be here somewhere. Just in terms of the understanding of
can you show us the cover?
Yeah, sorry, yes, yeah. Here it is, and it's just this. It's just the understanding that the graphic notation of ideas and thought is so powerful. The idea of an archive which is written on a bus ticket, because actually you're on a tram. You're on a tram and you need to record in extraordinary detail your ideas about the Second Empire in Paris, but you're on a tram in Berlin when you're doing it, or you endlessly discover that you need to make a list of let me find it for you, a list of the different you need to archive your own work, a catalogue of my published works. And when you see that, you begin to understand the energy at the end of the fingers and the head about what an archive might mean. The other great visual thing that I put into everyone's hand, and you know this so well, are Emily Dickinson's poems written on envelopes. A beautiful book, which of course I can't put my hands on. My poetry's round the corner.
Yeah, the little handwritten doodles and notes, they're so beautiful.
Yeah. And so that, and of course Robert Walser. I endlessly go back to Robert Walser as an interest, as a profound and point, obviously very poignant understanding of how of the need to archive your own thoughts in the moment. Those are things that I hand on endlessly. I buy them and give them away to people. So I'm sort of handing them back. But of course, you know them well. But those are the things that I love and adhere to.
Well, that's wonderful, and it really adds to the advice to a young artist.
Maybe that's my advice.
That's the second answer in a way, yeah.
Yes,
and Robert Walser, I started a museum for Robert Walser when I was a student in Geis in Appenzell, because he always went on these walks, of course. and in the area of Appenzell. And then Carl Selig. My favorite book is Carl Selig's work with Robert Walser.
It's there. There's a Robert Walser corner just over there. I can promise you. Ruskin, Robert Walser, Benjamin.
I was friendly with Werner Morlang, with whom I actually worked on this little vitrine museum, because we installed it in the restaurant where Walser always stopped and had a drink on his walks. We put the vitrine there, so it was a kind of a very tiny little project. And at that time, I spoke a lot to the late Werner Morlang, who devoted his entire life to decipher the micrograms. He's the one who...
that's extraordinary.
Which is a major, I think, literary achievement to have deciphered those. Yes. And this actually leads me to the very last thing, because this completes the interview in such a beautiful way. So we should end the interview here. Thank you so much. And this was the most amazing conversation. And I hope we can continue soon and see each other in person.
I love that. Bless you.